Hi, I'm Conor Meade, and we're here at the Canadian Science Policy Conference with Mr. Darryl Copeland, Senior Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and Policy Fellow at the University of Montreal Centre for International Studies and Research. Mr. Copeland is an analyst, educator, and consultant specializing in the relationship between science, technology, diplomacy, and international policy, and he's the author of Guerilla Diplomacy, Rethinking International Relations. Mr. Copeland, welcome to the conference, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Connor. My great pleasure to join you this morning.
All right, so today we spoke about science, diplomacy, and Canada's Diaspora Scientist community. So soft power of science has the power, one thing you said today is that the soft power of science has the power to transform diplomacy. So what are some strategies Canada can use to leverage our Diaspora Scientists for diplomatic ends?
Well, we can start by doing some basic research to determine whether or not the idea that we have of diaspora science communities corresponds to the reality out in broader Canadian society about whether such communities exist or not. Let's assume for purposes of policy development that we actually can identify some communities of scientists that are located in Canada but have in common a shared interest in their country of origin. So these could be, for example, Indian scientists who are living and working in Canada, first or second generation, or scientists from Nepal or Brazil, or it doesn't really matter where. Were we to determine that these kinds of communities did exist, so they would have to behave like communities. They would have to self-identify and cohere and share interests and have some sense of mutuality, you know, something in common. Were such communities to exist, they could be of tremendous value to people that are trying to formulate international policy, and particularly if the mandate is under a new government to come up with ideas for new policy directions. Because it seems to me that these communities, again, should they exist, could prove absolutely central in the delivery of programs of international scientific cooperation, which would advance Canada's bilateral relationship with the countries of origin of these diaspora science communities. So, I mean, let's just say, let's take India. We know there's a large number of Indian origin scientists in Canada. It's not clear to me, but I haven't done the research, whether or not that's a community, but let's assume it is. Not only would these Indian scientists working in Canada be bringing a huge amount to Canada in terms of the fruits of their research, but their knowledge and expertise, not to mention their cultural and linguistic capacity, could also be of enormous interest to Canada in our efforts to collaborate bilaterally with India in addressing some of the constraints that they're facing in advancing their own development agenda back in the subcontinent. In other words, these diaspora science communities, it seems to me, in the context of science diplomacy and international scientific cooperation, have the appeal of, theoretically anyway, being kind of dual use constructs, in that they both bring something to the community in which they're working, in this case Canada, but by virtue of their nature and constituency, could be of great interest to our foreign ministry, Global Affairs Canada, in advancing the bilateral policy agenda with India. So it strikes me that that's a formidable prospect. It holds a lot of promise, but the proof will be in the pudding, and I'm not sure that the basic research is yet in place that would allow the people responsible for articulating international policy to actually get on and use these diaspora science communities as a policy instrument to advance the bilateral agenda. We'll see.
Okay, thank you. So what do you think are some of the highest ROI investments we can make to support Canada's diaspora scientist community and to leverage that community for diplomacy? What are some tangible actions we should take?
I mean, well, first of all, is that basic research, which I'm not sure that's been done to identify such communities in Canada as may exist. Secondly, would be to put together a database that would not only have the names of the individual members of these putative communities, but also their institutional affiliation, their academic specialties, maybe a list of their publications and so on, so that we can really start to get a handle at a more granular level on what we could be dealing with. The third thing that we could do would be then to engage with these communities by trying to bring them into the policy development process. So that would involve some outreach to these diaspora communities, again, should they prove to exist. I think that might be very rich because that would bring an important international dimension into a policy formulation process, which traditionally has been driven more by domestic considerations. So again, I think there's a great deal of promise here, but a lot of questions remain outstanding, and it's complex, and there's many considerations. A great many of which I think we're not even aware of yet. It's the unknown unknowns. Yeah.
So when did you become so interested in diaspora scientists and recognize that it's such an important issue for diplomacy?
I came at diaspora science slightly obliquely. When I was doing the research for Guerilla Diplomacy, the book, which came out of my conviction after working almost 30 years in the Canadian Foreign Service that there was something the matter with the picture that I was a part of. That it wasn't delivering as advertised, that it was not producing results, that it was not structured as efficiently as could be the case, and that the work was not being done in an effective manner. So diplomacy was not delivering. And so I started inquiring into this, and one of my early findings was that there was a disconnect between the worlds of science and the worlds of diplomacy. And that this troubled me because old school diplomacy, very much constructed during the Cold War, had a lot to do with territorial ambition and ideological rivalry. But in the globalization age, post-Cold War, 21st century, the nature of the problems that I could see that people in foreign ministries were going to have to deal with had not so much to do with those old-style Cold War origin issues, and had a lot to do with these very complex matters ranging from climate change to diminishing biodiversity to resource scarcity to genomics to environmental collapse. None of those issues could be easily resolved by the sorts of people I'd spent my career working with in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And so I thought, in order to skill up our diplomats to deal with these issues, which have in common the fact that they're rooted in science and driven by technology, we're going to have to find a way to bridge the gap between the worlds of science and science and technology and the world of diplomacy and international policy, which were like bubbles floating around, really quite disconnected. I mean, just ask yourself, how many diplomats are scientists? How many scientists are diplomats? How often do diplomats and scientists meet? When they do, can they communicate? You know, scientists are notoriously bad communicators. Diplomats are very good communicators, and yet most of them probably dropped science in high school. There was a real disconnect here. And so that led me to science diplomacy. And then when you're looking for constituent elements and tools and instruments that might allow you to build capacity in the area of science diplomacy, that's where the diaspora piece comes in. And it's not something that I had been thinking much about. I mean, I've been trying to bring this from a kind of a wide ambit right down to what we're talking about today, which is this notion of diaspora science and how does it fit within our broader thinking about science and diplomacy. I confess that I hadn't thought much about it until I was asked to really do some analysis based on what I know about science and diplomacy to try and formulate some of these questions. And as I say, my provisional findings are that this is an idea with glowing prospects, but I wouldn't be willing to put a high stakes wager on a successful outcome until I knew a lot more than we know now about these communities, what knowledge and expertise may be embedded in them, how might that fit with bilateral or regional agendas that the Government of Canada has got in place, and whether or not as instruments or tools of science diplomacy we can really work effectively with these communities should we exist. So a lot of questions, should they exist? A lot of questions, some potentially highly productive answers, but I think in the interim what we need is more information, more analysis, and I hope that with this conference that process will be well launched.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, as a question to wrap up, I'd just like to ask for everyone watching, for anyone who's interested in your book, Guerilla Diplomacy, reading more about your work, reading more about what you're doing, where's the best place to find you online? GuerillaDiplomacy.com. That's 2 R's, 2 L's. That's the website, and all of my publications are available online. There's a link to the introduction to the book published by Lynn Reiner. That's free for download. My Twitter handle is @GuerillaDiplo. I produce an op-ed or an analytical piece for the popular press every couple of weeks, which is easily searchable. I teach courses on science, technology, diplomacy, and international policy in a variety of places. I've taught at the Monk Center. I've taught at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at Ottawa U. I teach at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. I've taught in New Zealand. I've taught in the States, in Malaysia, in a lot of different places, and I continue to look for teaching opportunities. So for students, again, just a bit of a moving target, but if you'd like to take the course, that's probably the best way to really dive more deeply into this fascinating subject area. All right.
Of science, diplomacy, international policy, and for my fellow citizens, Canadian foreign policy and its ever expanding prospects as a result of October the 19th.
Mm. Excellent. Well, on that note, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for a very thoughtful interview and for participating on our panel here at the Canadian Science Policy Conference in 2015. So once again, visit GuerillaDiplomacy.com, follow Guerilla Diplo on Twitter, And thank you so much, Mr. Copeland. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure, Connor.
Thank you.